Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. Something new is happening to me, and I've never had this happen before, so I'm going to talk about it. I'm switching time zones without moving physical location. If you're in North America, you're probably sitting there going, duh, we just switched to daylight savings time. Hello. If you're in Europe, you're probably like, oh, it's those North Americans. They're always 2 weeks ahead of everybody because they've decided to be. And if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, you're probably going, oh, these Northern Hemisphere people always think they're the center of the universe. Would they shut up already? Fair point. But in this case, it's none of those things. Where I live, in British Columbia, we have apparently decided, for whatever reason, that we're going to be on permanent daylight savings time now. I have an entirely different video in me, honestly, where I could go on for a full half hour about how stupid I think this is, about how this flies in the face of most of the established science, how it's been misrepresented to the public, how it's misrepresenting the scientists that they're even quoting. I have a whole bunch to say about that, but that's not this video, that's not this channel. So instead, what I'm going to talk about is something related to this, which is TZ data. In order to explain what this is, let's think about the concept of time itself for a moment here and how computers represent it. Most of the time in our head, when we think of time and specifically time zones, we're comparing this to a reference of some sort. And most people would think of this as being, the standard GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. And then you think about your time zones as indexed from Greenwich Mean Time. And if you're a bit of a history buff, you go, oh, Greenwich is where the UK Naval Observatory is located, and that's just where they marked time, and then that just became the standard. And because the British Navy and the British Empire kind of spread the entire world over, giving rise to the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because of that, that's kind of where we're getting our understanding of where time zones are, and that's why Greenwich Mean Time is the standard. If you're in the sciences, you have a different standard in mind, which is UTC. UTC stands for Universal Time Coordinated, which I think is a really cool name for a completely different reason. Universal, I mean, you could have said global, but we went for universal. Okay, fine. Time, we know what that is, but then coordinated. Ordinal just means it's numbered. And so coordinal means that it's been cooperatively ordinated, cooperatively numbered, collectively numbered. This is universal time collectively determined, collectively numbered. This is just what we've agreed it's going to be. This is the universal time standard, period. Here's where it is. In most respects, you can consider this the same as Greenwich Mean Time, mostly, except there's some quirks there. Most time zones are just an index of plus or minus a number of hours from Greenwich Mean Time, typically. But Universal Time Coordinated is also adjusted on a periodic basis to account for leap seconds, the actual change in the Earth's rotation, because that is slowing down gradually over time. And so in order to have the precision necessary for sciences, you need to add and sometimes subtract a leap second in order to keep the hours where they should be. That's not just a leap day or a leap year. That's just a second being added to account for the change in the amount of time in the day, let alone in the year. So that's a bit of geekery in and of itself. But UTC is how we actually officially measure time zones now. UTC plus or minus for your number of hours in your time zone, if you're thinking about time zone. But in actuality, the question of time is even more different than that, because you have different jurisdictions that follow different time standards. Take the Canadian province of Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan does not observe daylight savings time at all. It's standard time all year round, which is exactly the way it should be. Good going, Saskatchewan. And that's it. So if you're thinking about time zone, yes, they're on Central Standard Time, which is what we call it in North America. But in the summertime, they're still on Central Standard Time. But if you look at Mountain Standard Time, which is just to the west of it, province of Alberta, when they go to daylight savings time, Mountain Daylight Time becomes the same thing as Central Standard Time, because they go from UTC -7 to UTC -6. So then it becomes kind of the same thing. And you can't say it's just the province of Saskatchewan, because there's a couple of cities in Saskatchewan, Lloydminster, I believe it is, that chooses to observe mountain time, which is in Alberta. And they do observe daylight savings time to keep them in sync with Alberta. So they're a part of Saskatchewan that is part of Saskatchewan in the winter, part of Saskatchewan in the summer when they're on UTC -6, but in the winter they flop over to Mountain Standard Time and they're part of Alberta. Okay. There are parts of BC that do the same thing. They've chosen to be on Mountain Time and they do their flip-flop. And then you have some places that have just decided we're not going to observe daylight savings time at all. And they might be in the middle of a different time zone. Or you might have had different jurisdictions that observe different rules at different times in history, like BC is doing now. We have everything now before today, March 8th, 2026. We observed standard time and daylight time. Starting from today, March 8th, 2026, it's all permanent daylight savings time. We're now permanently in UTC -7, which is stupid. But we're there permanently. And we've decided to just call this Pacific time. Pacific time is a term that was already in use because it was Pacific Standard Time or Pacific Daylight Time. That was the name for UTC -8, Pacific Standard Time. And then in Pacific Daylight Time, it became UTC -7. And you would use Pacific time to just mean whatever the current time is in the Pacific time zone, whether that's standard or daylight. But now we're going to reuse that, and Pacific time for us just means British Columbia time now. Why, I don't know. But so you've got a lot of ambiguity there. You've got ambiguity in the naming. You've got ambiguity in the jurisdiction, because the locale where you are may not be your time zone, and they may change historically through the years and administrations and political decisions, whatever. So how do you keep track of it all? How do you keep track of it all? Well, for a computer, the easiest thing for it to do, certainly in professional operating systems like Linux and Unix and Macintosh to some degree, because it's based on Darwin, which was an offshoot of BSD, you follow UTC. You follow Universal Time Coordinated. And then you adjust from that. All of the dates and times are natively expressed in UTC because that is a single standard. Arbitrary? Yes, but that's the standard that we have cooperatively agreed on. It is universal time coordinated. Cool. And if you're in Windows, you're like, that's too complicated for people. Let's make it, easier by saying everything is just going to be in local time. And then if we need to convert to a different time zone, we'll do that. But, all the dates are going to be treated as though it's local time, which means if you save a file on Linux in standard time and then in daylight savings time, you'll have the same. Okay. Hang on a second. Let me think of a more concrete example for this. If you save a file 1 hour before daylight savings time kicks in, and you go forward an hour, daylight savings kicks in, and you go forward another hour, and then you save another file an hour after, your clock has gone from 1 to 4. That's a time difference of 3 hours. The actual timestamps on the file, if you look at it in UTC, are 2 hours apart. Because you had 1 hour before, and then the time changed, and then you went 1 hour afterwards. That's only a gap of 2 hours. And so the timestamps on the files in Linux will be 2 hours apart. But your operating system will interpret the difference and say, okay, but this timestamp was in a different time zone, a different daylight savings time, so I'm going to show it to you as though it is 3 hours apart. In Windows, when it changes from daylight savings time when it changes from standard time to daylight savings time, it actually adjusts the clock in your computer, the hardware clock. So when you save a file like that, you're actually creating a file with timestamps that are 3 hours apart, even though it was only 2 hours apart in reality. And so Windows continually, if you're going to do things, for example, if you're robocopying files, there's a switch there that says /DST. Take into account the fact that daylight savings time may be a factor here and adjust the timestamps on the files accordingly. Okay, you actually have to tell Windows to account for that, because otherwise it's going to treat the file times as it's just whatever it was locally, which in the autumn becomes even more interesting because, you go from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, and then your time zone time goes back to 1 o'clock and forward to 2 o'clock again. In universal time coordinated, you've just gone forward by 2 hours, whereas in Windows time, you've gone forward an hour, back an hour in time, and then forward an hour again. So you've only got timestamps that are 1 hour apart instead of 2 hours apart. Crazy. So, in Linux, what I'm trying to get to after that explanation on the difference between Windows and Linux, Windows has fewer time zones because it just has a concept of a time zone, similar to the way most people think about it. Linux actually does something more complicated and cooler because there is a component that Linux and BSD uses called TZ data. That is the IANA time zone database. And conceptually, it's very different because it's not just a time zone and then a list of exceptions on whether you're in this jurisdiction or that jurisdiction, whatever. It's just defined as an area where the local clocks have maintained the same standard since 1970. Because that's when that is when the Unix time epoch started, was midnight, January 1st, 1970. So TZ data says, okay, well, we're just going to take this as a region where the local clocks have maintained the same standard since 1970, whatever that standard is. And then it's named by general geographic continent or region. You can have America, which incidentally is North America, Central America, and South America. It's not just North America. And for some things like island nations, it's not really associated with a continent, so you have the major oceans in there as well. You have Pacific, you have Indian, you have Arctic, etc. So you have your continent, and then they'll pick a major city. Not a nation, because nations can change, and city names tend to be more consistent than nation names, interestingly enough. But that does mean that in the time zone database, there's already a difference between America/Vancouver and America/Los Angeles. America Los Angeles essentially covers, the western United States. America Vancouver covered most of BC. And America/Yukon is the Yukon Territory, which is just north of us. They have also been observing permanent daylight savings time for, I don't know exactly how long, but they've been observing that. But America/Vancouver was different. It was not always in sync with the rest of the Pacific time zone. And so you've already got in the time zone database 3 different locales that you would usually understand to be in the same time zone. Yukon is always in Pacific daylight, so it's always UTC -7. So effectively, in the wintertime, they were on Mountain Standard Time. And then in the summer, they were on Pacific Daylight Time. Continually flopping their time zone back and forth according to the classical time zone definition. But always UTC -7. But that was very different from America Vancouver, the rest of BC, and also different from the rest of, the western United States. And you'll have some different place names in there. For example, I believe, and this is just from memory, so don't quote me on this, I believe there's also one, America Dawson Creek. Dawson Creek is a locality in BC, but it's one of the communities that chooses to observe a different time standard. And so it's not part of the same time locality, time zone, within TZ data. And so this is a database that continues forward to interpret for a computer, how do I convert timestamps from this single, unified, scientific standard, universal time, coordinated? How do I translate that to whatever my administrator has told me is local time? It follows the time database. And the time zone database continues to be updated, often multiple times a year. There's a mailing list for this. It is also gatewayed to a news group because that's how all of that used to be, and it still is, for discussing how this is going to be updated, making sure everybody agrees on this. There is even an RFC outlining the procedures for updating the time zone database, which is kind of cool. It's just this piece of software, this time zone database, that people rarely think about, and yet it is instrumental in allowing computers to update their understanding of how we humans have decided to label our time, wherever we are, whether that's a time zone or a time locality, whatever we've chosen to label it. The time zone database helps the computer make the translation from a single standard. If you're using Windows, it's similar. Windows does not use the IANA time zone database directly. It's using, I believe it's following a Unicode standard that is kind of an offshoot of time zone data, but Windows does not recognize all of those localities. because it's not based on a time locality where a geographic region where the clocks have been on the same standard since 1970. It just follows a time zone. And then occasionally, if there's a big enough exception, it might have an exception to it. For example, I know in Windows there's UTC -8 Pacific time, Pacific Standard Time, but there's also UTC -8 Baja California, because that's in Mexico. That's a different time locality. So that's one of the exceptions. I think there's a total of 3 localities, and I don't remember them all, but Windows recognizes 3 different localities from memory, which is UTC -8. And if you choose the correct one, cool, it'll understand, okay, what are the rules for daylight savings time, what are the rules for etc. But it's different from TZ data. TZ data has more options because it's recognizing the geographic localities involved rather than just what are we willing to recognize as official time zones. Okay, so that's interesting. I don't know what this is going to look like because, quite honestly, our legislature just announced that we were doing this arbitrarily a week ago. I doubt very much that that's been sufficient time for TZ data to have been updated to our new standard. And it's going to throw a lot of people for a loop. For now, today, we've entered daylight savings time the same as the rest of North America, excepting those places that don't observe daylight savings time. And again, good on them. Way to go, Saskatchewan. But it will come. By the time we get to this autumn 2026, Washington, Oregon, California will all go back to Pacific Standard Time and will be still in Pacific Daylight Time. By that time, I expect there will be an update to the time zone database. And all of the Linux machines that I have will have installed that update, and they will understand, okay, well, we're going to keep following UTC, but local time standards have now changed. We're not going to change the display of those timestamps back to UTC -8. We're going to continue displaying them in UTC -7 because that's the new standard here. But the database will also say, hey, if you were looking back at files that were saved historically, back in a time where standard time was observed, then you can display the timestamp for those files in standard time, because that's what it was at the time. At the time, haha, pun. And it has that retroactive accuracy as well. I'm sitting here going, I know systems that I get because they're from the United States that are configured in America/Los Angeles. If I have any systems that are configured in America, Los Angeles, that I haven't updated to America, Vancouver, those systems would suddenly go into a different time zone when they are not supposed to. So over the next, 6 months, give or take, until the first Sunday in November, I'm going to have to go and review a whole bunch of systems. All of my switches and routers in Cisco iOS, I'm going to have to go and update the summertime definition, because we're not going to be going back and forth to summertime anymore. It'll just be, we're on UTC -7. That's it. That's just the end of the story. I'm going to have to make sure that, like I said, the Linux ones will pick up TZ data fine. Great. I won't need to worry about those so much. I just need to make sure that they are set for America/Vancouver rather than America, Los Angeles. The Windows machines Microsoft will have to publish an update to that, maybe. And if they don't, then I'll just have to put everything on. I'll have to figure out what time zone is UTC -7 year round, Yukon maybe, and just put everything on a time zone definition that doesn't switch to daylight savings time. We'll have to figure out what that looks like. So yeah, I mean, I've changed time zones without having moved at all. And it's going to require a change in how all of this equipment is configured and how it interprets time. But for some of the equipment, it'll be a lot easier than for others. So there you go. Something new and something that I'm going to bet a lot of people don't have to go through on a regular basis. But here we are. Cool. Hopefully you have enjoyed hearing about that and enjoyed just thinking about these representations and how we make it all work. If you have thoughts on other things that you'd like to hear me talk about or things that you'd like to see me demonstrate, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door NetAdmin, and we will see you next time.